Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to welcome the third cohort of our Virtual Visiting Scholars program. My name is Crystal Bedley. I'm the project director for the ARC Network, and I'd like to thank everyone who registered for today's ARC Network webinar. Before we begin, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. We do so that we can make it available to all registrants, and we'll be uploading the recording to the ARC Network online community platform following today's event. While we all may be becoming increasingly more familiar with the Zoom platform, I just wanted to highlight some features that we'll be using today on this app. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. Towards the end of today's webinar, we'll share some links and our feedback survey in the chat box from today's conversation. If you have a question you'd like to ask any of the panelists, please add them to the Q&A. And you can also upvote questions that are of particular interest to you, and we'll have a chance to then monitor and engage those Q&A questions. We'll give approximately 5 to 10 minutes towards the end to answer and address those questions from attendees. We also have closed captioning for today's webinar. So in the menu, you should see a closed caption button, CC button. Selecting the arrow, or the caret as it's sometimes referred to, will give you 3 options. You can hide subtitles, you can view full transcript, which will give you access to all of the caption, or you can adjust the caption size or adjust the caption size. Just so you know, there's about a 10-second delay for the captioning. Before getting into more specifics on the purpose of today's webinar, I'd like to share more about who we are at the ARC Network. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges a gap between researchers and practitioners. As a STEM equity brain trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting and curating previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions like the virtual visiting scholars are engaging in. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as a backbone organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, if you're not already familiar, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can join the community. It's also worth noting that the ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating what we call the 3 I's, which are intersectionality, intentionality, and inclusivity. The Virtual Visiting Scholars Program exemplifies this approach. And to tell you more about it, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Page.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Stephanie Page, Community Engagement Manager for the ARC Network, and I'll be introducing our panelists today and moderating this session. First, as some background, I would just want to share a little bit about the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. Each year, the ARC Network selects 2 to 4 virtual visiting scholars to conduct research on existing or emerging themes from scholarly literature or gender equity in STEM workplaces. Virtual visiting scholars employ qualitative and/or quantitative meta-analytic and meta-synthesis techniques to identify best practices, structural barriers, or larger themes from existing literature. Prior to this cohort, who began their projects about 1 month ago, the ARC Network has funded 5 scholars who explored topics including mentoring of women of color, to gender bias and citation analysis, and practices to academic entrepreneurship. To learn more about these projects and to read final reports, please visit our website. Again, that is equityinstem.org. So now I am very excited to introduce our newest cohort, our speakers for today. First is Dr. Kimberly Scott. She is a professor in Women and Gender Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University and the founding executive director of ASU's Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. In her work as a virtual visiting scholar, Dr. Scott applies intersectionality as an analytical strategy to determine how funding agencies reinforce or challenge majoritarian narratives of girls and women of color in STEM. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Scott. Dr. Ramón Barthelemy is currently an assistant professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Utah at Salt Lake City. As a virtual visiting scholar, Dr. Barthelemy synthesizes research on the experiences and perspectives of gender and sexual minority persons in STEM higher education. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Barthelemy. Dr. Joya Misra is currently professor of sociology and public policy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. As a virtual visiting scholar, Dr. Misra addresses the impacts of intersectional identity on and inclusion in decision-making and leadership, with additional emphasis on retention and career advancement of faculty. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Misra. And Dr. Ramón Goings is an assistant professor in the language, literacy, excuse me, and culture interdisciplinary doctoral program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. As a virtual visiting scholar, Dr. Goings conducts a meta-analysis of research on contingent STEM faculty to assess the inclusion of faculty at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. Thank you so much to you, Dr. Goings, for joining us today. I am so excited, and I will jump right in on introducing our topics. So first and foremost, our first question to our scholars for today is to describe your virtual visiting scholar project and share how your background shapes it. We'll start with you, Dr. Misra.
Okay, thank you so much to everybody at ARC Network, as well as to everyone who's in attendance today. So my project, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got here and then what it's about. So I started working on these issues in the 1990s, hard to believe. I went out on the job market in 1993 and there was a little bit of recession. I did get a job. And my experience that year on the job market was that everybody said, of course, you got a job. You know, sort of referencing the fact that as a woman and perhaps as a woman of color, I was somebody who was advantaged on the job market. And I started doing research that showed that, in fact, women and women of color are really disadvantaged on the job market, and really tried to sort of think through empirically the kinds of assumptions that people made. In the 2000s, I started studying more about the way that care and gender intersect in shaping faculty lives, and ended up doing a lot of work on faculty workload. And that led me to a study on workload that's an experiment with Carrie Ann O'Meara and Audrey Jager and a number of other really wonderful colleagues. And there, you know, we see really consistently, this was true in all of my work, that women tend to do a lot more of the service work, do a lot more of the care, labor, the institutional housekeeping that needs to be done in institutions. But the thing that was really fascinating to me is that I knew that women are doing a lot of heavy lifting around service at a lot of universities. This is really common, and women of color in particular doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and yet are much less likely to be found in the highest leadership positions. And so I really wanted to make sense of that disjuncture. What is going on that explains that women are committing so much to institutions, but they aren't necessarily being lifted up into leadership positions. Or as they end up in leadership positions, say as department chairs end up having less authority. So there's kind of this moving up the down escalator process that seems to be happening for women, and especially women of color. So that's why I proposed the project that I did. And the project is really sort of bringing together the literature on workload and how it's gendered and racialized that I've been working on for a long time, with a literature that's newer to me on leadership and how it's gendered and racialized. I've spent the last month going through a lot of different sources. I've downloaded, I think, around 300 articles. that are written from this standpoint. In fact, actually, many of them are dissertations. So it turns out at schools of education around the country, many people write dissertations often on like 3 or 4 leaders, like women of color leaders that are provosts or that are deans or that are chairs. And so I have a bunch of dissertations that I'm reading, as well as a lot of academic articles, but probably like 50 dissertations. And trying to like sort of work through that, really map that literature, and then understand how I can take the insights from that literature and connect them with the insights of the literature on workload. So yeah, that's where I came from, and that's how I got to this project.
Critical questions are being answered with these projects, and you addressed so much. I'm thinking of the connectivity between all of the projects, and Dr. Goings, you come to mind particularly because of your focus on contingent faculty. Can you take a moment to respond a little bit more about what your project is and how your background has shaped it?
Sure. So first, thank you all for having me. This particular project comes out of really the need or the reviewing the literature for actually another research study I'm doing with my colleagues, Dr. Larry Walker and Jelena Austin. We're doing a study currently right now looking at the experiences of STEM contingent faculty at minority serving institutions. So in preparation for that project, I started to review the literature to just kind of see what's there. And in the literature about STEM contingent faculty, there were studies about faculty of color, but in a number of studies, they actually just said, we're not going to discuss the race, ethnicity, or gender of the participants. And I thought that was very interesting to see, like, why is that? And so I initially started with a couple of articles. And as I started to kind of review more and more, I started to see like this is somewhat of a trend. And I said, I need to explore this more because I just want to understand, as we're thinking about our own project and just the literature in general, what's happening for STEM contingent faculty. And for contingent faculty, I mean those who are not on the tenure track. So sometimes they're described as lecturers, adjuncts, full-time non-tenure track faculty. Because if you all know, and particularly in STEM, for students are more likely to have a contingent faculty member teach their courses. And this idea that for scholars of color in particular, is kind of connects to Joy's topic, is that scholars of color are less likely to secure those tenure track positions because we know how racism in higher education works. And so if we know that, and we know that there's a large pool of faculty of color that would be considered as STEM contingent faculty, what is our research saying about their experiences and how they navigate higher education as contingent faculty? And in STEM, there was not a conversation about race and gender. I just found it in ethnicity. So I just found that very interesting. And in my analysis, I'm actually replicating analysis I did in another meta-synthesis in gifted and talented education, where I explored the intersection of race and poverty in gifted journals. And so I'm essentially taking that methodology and applying it to this to see, do I see similar trends? And then also to see, are there certain disciplines when scholars are writing about that actually talk about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. And this particular project also comes from my own experience as being just a contingent faculty member and knowing what it's like to bounce around multiple institutions, not be able sometimes to find full-time positions, even though you're more than qualified and actually have a sometimes stronger skill set than the people who have the tenure track positions. So I'm just interested to see kind of how that all meshes in the research, and then what insights. I'm hoping that I can just develop a new research agenda for folks who are looking at contingent faculty, because a lot of work that's done on contingent faculty, but not as much in STEM. So I'm hoping that this spans a new research agenda from that.
Amazing. Once again, amazing. You will see so many, like my cheekbones are going to hurt today. You will just see me grinning all day. Kind of thinking more deeply or speaking more deeply into the context of gender and sexual minorities, Dr. Barthelemy, because you're looking at this on a very deep level in the context of STEM higher education, can you begin to describe your project and how your background has shaped it?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this awesome group. So I'm doing work looking at gender and sexual minorities, also known as LGBT folks, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender scientists. And throughout the work that I've done as a graduate student, Fulbright, and now as a faculty member, I have primarily looked at gender, and I've looked at LGBT issues and a little bit of race issues, but they've always been separate. And one thing that I realized in doing a lot of the analysis, particularly for a large survey we did of LGBT plus physicists, was that gender was always a significant variable. It was always intersecting with other people's experiences, as were ethnic and racial identities. So the project that I proposed for ARC and that was accepted is one that is looking at the literature on LGBT issues in STEM, but specifically looking at intersections and trying to understand how multiple identities interplay together to impact people's education. Because unfortunately, one thing we have found before when looking at LGBT physicists or even women in physics or STEM at large is you'll hear participants say, I don't even have the opportunity to be discriminated against for being LGBT, because first I have to deal with the discrimination for being a woman or a person of color or someone with a disability. And these are things that I've heard multiple times in the focus groups that we've run at national physics conferences. So now I'm trying to expand the view to STEM overall and to try to basically wrangle the growing literature on LGBT scientists to understand what has been done, how has it been done, and where do we need to go next? And some of this means branching outside of just specifically the LGBT STEM literature, but also looking at the LGBT higher ed literature at large. There's some wonderful work that has come out of minority serving institutions on African-American LGBT persons in higher education, for example. And that kind of work I want to influence the literature review, because just because we don't specifically have it in the sciences now, we can learn a lot from what our peers have done in non-STEM education research. And how does my background impact that? It's a pretty strong question. So I'm biracial, I'm queer, I'm a physicist, and I'm an education researcher. And it's hard to disentangle all those things, but when I came to physics education research, I came with a view of social justice and wanting to essentially follow the campsite rule, which is always leave it in better shape than you came to it. So all the research that I do is really focused on trying to make physics a better place for everyone. And now I'm branching out to science more largely. And I think that probably has been significantly influenced by my own experiences in academia. And I can resonate with Dr. Misra, because when I went on the job market multiple times, people used to tell me, oh, you'll immediately get a job, you're Hispanic. But I proved them wrong, because the first couple times I went on the job market, I did not get a job. So it took me actually, I left academia, went and did stuff in the public and the private sector, and then I ended up coming back a few years later. So I'm excited to be part of this initiative, and thank you for listening to my perspective.
Wow, thank you so much. And Dr. Scott, you are applying an intersectional an analytical strategy to your study, which really looks at the impact of funding agencies and how they can reinforce narratives when it comes to girls and women of color in STEM. Can you expand on that and share how your background shapes your project?
Sure, and like all of my esteemed colleagues, I'm really grateful for this opportunity and also being here today. So like Dr. Misra, I want to go back to the 90s, and it was then that I was a classroom teacher and in what was then called a special needs district, which is just a code for a district that was disproportionately African-American low income. And I noticed, being in that district, how poorly not only the children and their parents were treated, but how low those expectations were. There was this assumption that we now call deficit thinking, that these young people just really were not deserving of opportunities that were going to push them to become the leaders I knew, and many of us knew, could begin. And so I left the classroom and I returned to school, and I earned my doctorate of education, and I went on to become a professor of leaders, because I ardently believed in impact. And I said, you know, I can stay in the classroom with what I called my lumpkins, and I can impact maybe 30 to 35 or 40 in a year, but if I can work with ed leaders, particularly in urban ed, that impact can be exponential. So I started teaching ed leaders. And there was a rhetoric that continued to trouble me. And that was, how are we going to systematically engage what we call now underrepresented minorities, and I can talk about why I don't particularly like that term, ERM. It sounds like a disease, according to what Kamau Bob has written, and I agree. But how can we better engage these communities, and particularly the fastest growing, which are girls of color, African American, Native American, and Latinx. So skipping ahead, when I was wooed by Arizona State University to move from Brooklyn to what I call the surface of the sun, Arizona, I got the opportunity to work with some phenomenal minds, computer science and social justice, and justice studies, and indigenous knowledge systems, to think very carefully about our context, meaning the import of the digital age, and how it was really a social justice issue, again, for what I call under-anticipated communities, again, girls of color. And so I started a program called CompuGirls, and just very briefly, it's an out-of-school program. And at the time, the first cohort was 2006. And we were one of the first out-of-school programs specifically looking at not only how to provide opportunities for girls of color who are underrepresented by engaging their tech skills, but also their power skills, right? So really fortunate to get funding, to pilot the program, and also to be responsive to the AAAS report from 1975, to look very carefully at the impact of the program on the participants. And that put me into an interesting jet stream. So I started noticing other programs and other individuals like myself, like Joya and Ramon and Ramon, that were invested in these ideas of equity, and particularly intersectionality. And I started paying attention particularly to funding, not only because I needed funding to do my work, but also in terms of just how funding decisions were being made. And we see, particularly for funding categories called broadening participation, there have been gobs of money that have been put forward. You know, specifically 2018, 3 federal agencies put forward $2.8 billion to $3.4 billion earmarked for broadening participation. But I return to the idea, like, what's the impact of this funding? What have we seen in terms of improvement, specifically for girls, women of color, and STEM? And I don't want to belabor with statistics, but in some cases, we've seen a decrease of girls, women of color going into and persisting in certain STEM areas, and particularly technology. So with the support of being a virtual visiting scholar, and in collaboration with a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Michael Simeone, we're engaging in a computational topic modeling methodology to apply intersectionality, not as a framework that's simply looking at multiple identities, but thinking very, very carefully about power, how power is really about relationships, and the outcomes in terms of the manifestation in critical praxis, specifically for funding decisions. And so my hope is for this particular initiative that I'm so excited to engage in, and also to have the support to do so, that we will be able to reveal how decision-making, structural impediments, and funding patterns occur before a program such as CompuGirls is implemented. Thank you.
Wow. So I'm just amazed at this moment, because all of your research topics hit on things that are just impactful for me on a personal level, given my career. I'm STEM all the way through, from engineering degrees to biology degrees to biochemistry and biophysics. So these really touch me on a very, very, very deep level, and I understand how much impact you all have had and how much you will continue to have. And I'm so thankful that we get to have you all as our 2020-2021 cohort. The next question really focuses more on what excites you most about your projects, and what are you really hoping your project will illuminate about STEM equity research and practice. Since you ended us on the last question. Dr. Scott, I will start with you.
Sure. So I am incredibly excited by a couple of features. One is we are going to create an unprecedented database looking specifically at what we call gray literature. In this case, the metasynthesis is on solicitations or RFPs from both federal agencies to community foundations to private foundations, and searching for how certain words appear, such as girls of color, African American girls, technology, and other lexicons. What excites me about this is that it can hopefully lead to encouraging funders to take a really careful look at how they are articulating their vision for broadening participation. Is it reinforcing ideas that ultimately are leading to disparity, or is it challenging those ideas and ultimately that system towards more equitable ends? So I'm hoping that the project is going to eliminate or illuminate not only equity and the praxis of it, but how we may unintentionally maintain a schism by way of funders' intents and their outcomes. So that's me.
I love that. Dr. Barthelemy, how about you? What are you most excited about, and what do you hope your project will illuminate?
So one of the big focuses of my project is trying to think about policies that really can be implied from the research, or how we can build better research methodologies to construct policies. So I'm excited about the opportunity to think more deeply about how we can change how we interact with each other and how we set up structure and systems on campus in order to facilitate change for underrepresented groups, underserved groups, and in particular, in my study, it's LGBT folks.
Thank you. And Dr. Goings, how about you?
Well, I'm excited, one, because of the way I'm doing my analysis, to actually look at how do scholars actually talk about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. So I'm interested in like some of the terms used, just how are folks described? You know, that's one aspect. But a second research question I'm asking in my meta synthesis is that what are like the best practices for supporting the needs of STEM contingent faculty at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. So I'm just curious, because I'm doing a research project that's focused on that currently, almost some ways this project to inform the empirical work that I'm doing. Just very interested to see what are the best practices currently in the literature, and then what's missing. And then I'm hoping that, again, I can provide a new research agenda or things for scholars to think about moving forward.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. And Dr. Misra?
Well, I'm excited about a lot of different things in this project. It's a little, it's like sort of, I have lots of different hopes for the directions it's going to lead me in. I think that one of the things that's been really fun for me is getting a sense of how leadership literature that comes out of higher ed and management connects to the literature on workload, which mostly comes out of labor and sociology and higher ed. So like, how do we make those things fit together? I've been like sort of really interested in thinking through how there are many different barriers to women and women of color in particular in STEM careers, and how those barriers both lead us into like increased service and leadership expectations, but kind of provide this kind of sticky floor, or what people call like a glass ceiling or an adobe ceiling or a concrete ceiling or a lavender ceiling. How there's like this ceiling effect that still keeps us, despite this work that we're doing, out of those sort of central leadership positions. So I don't know, I'm excited to see wherever literature takes me. I am somebody who loves doing empirical research. So I am in the middle, I'm on an advanced IT team at UMass Amherst. I am in the middle of a big empirical study, and I just keep making myself like saying, okay, can't collect more data. I'm gonna focus on what this literature is telling me first, and then I'll move, I expect, into empirical data in the future.
Thank you so much. And keeping in a lot of the conversations that the ARC Network has been having, we have our webinar series on ensuring equity and institutional responses to COVID-19. I wanted to check in with you all today on, how has the age of COVID influenced your research questions and practices? Can we start with you, Dr. Goings?
Sure, I would say like COVID really spurred this research topic for me, just generally. As you think, institutions, we're seeing cuts in terms of faculty, staff, layoffs, furloughs. When we have that happen, in many ways, you're going to see an increase in contingent faculty use because sometimes they see it as a lower cost of entry in terms of still ensuring classes are taught, but at a lower cost. And so I think this particular project is really connected to that because I think we're going to see this increase in contingent faculty. And I'm just curious as if research informs policy and practice, and as scholars, we're talking about STEM contingent faculty at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender in maybe some deficit ways, then it's no wonder what we see kind of in practice. So I'm really interested in how, as scholars, we talk about this group first, and then hopefully to put forth some new policies and practices for the field. And so definitely it's all spawned from COVID.
Thank you. And Dr. Barthelemy, what are your thoughts?
I think the big thing now is we have to be really considerate of what students are going through. And a lot of the research that I do focuses on students. So currently I'm trying not to do any research on students unless I can compensate them for their time. And I'm trying to be very careful about that. So I feel like that has had a huge impact. The secondary impact is in the lives of LGBT physicists and scientists generally. A lot of students have been forced to go to their biological homes, and those oftentimes are environments where they can't be out, they're being misgendered. So when we think about the environment in which students are learning, for some LGBT science students, it's highly problematic right now.
Thank you for addressing that. It's a conversation that I think we need to have on a far deeper level. Dr. Misra, what are your thoughts on doing this work in the age of COVID?
Well, certainly everything has changed. And because I'm a member of a wonderful team of researchers at UMass Amherst focused on equity and inclusion among in faculty careers, we really had to shift everything to be very much thinking about how to push the university to make sure that we don't see the impact of the pandemic leading to a less diverse faculty. And there's lots of reasons why we might see that. So we've been very, very focused and gotten a lot of really wonderful practices and policies in place, and now are doing a lot of work to publicize, to try to get other universities to put these things in place. So that has taken up tons of my time. I do think that for this project, one of the things that I'm really trying to be alert to and think about is that as leaders, women can sort of be put into glass cliffs, so they can be asked to lead in moments that are really difficult, with the notion, but then they can be sort of dumped and a man can be brought back in, as like the successful follow-upper. So at moments like this of crisis, women are more likely to end up in leadership positions, and I really want to be thinking a lot about that as I'm carrying out my ARC Network project.
Thank you. And Dr. Scott, how has the age of COVID influenced your research questions and practices?
Sure. I am very, very aware of how funding agencies are responding to COVID. And I've been trying to take note and maintain a heightened sensitivity to what the RFPs are articulating and what they're not, thinking about the challenges of really applying intersectional frameworks in an authentic way. So as I'm looking at responses from a myriad of funding agencies that want to do good as it relates to COVID, what I'm paying attention to is what does that look like? is it taking into account ideas of the fact that very few women of color, especially from certain socioeconomic status, have access to the type of childcare that would allow them to survive this pandemic in a sustainable way? Are questions being asked or funding decisions being made keeping in mind the contextual nature of COVID and healthcare and so many other aspects that an intersectional framework would help to highlight? And so I think COVID, just in general, just made me more aware and strengthened my intent for this project to think about the situatedness of the questions that I'm hoping to answer.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to encourage our audience to drop any questions you might have in the Q&A box. We have someone monitoring so that we can ask our scholars those questions. And so I wanted to just really quickly ask, I guess, in a way, a less serious question, but still somewhat serious. You know, in the age of COVID, the types of questions that you all are asking, the work that you're doing, the investment that you're making in education, in STEM on the level of students, on the level of potential students, and faculty and administrators, what do you really go to keep yourself motivated and to help you thrive through this time? Can we start with Dr. Barthelemy?
That's a tough question right now. How do I stay motivated? You know, this probably isn't a great answer, but I think my motivation comes from hope for the future, right? So and I'll tell you, I've actually completely disconnected from all news. So I basically use my research as the one area that I know that I can help people. And then I also do the mentorship that I do as a faculty member and the teaching that I do as a faculty member. And it's those small day-to-day interactions of helping a student learn how to draw a first body diagram or helping a student apply for a scholarship that gives me hope and meaning. And that's really what I've been clinging on to in these times.
Thank you so much. And actually, that was a beautiful answer. How about you, Dr. Misra?
It's so hard. I was just thinking about this because I'm really lucky to be at a university that, even though I'm in Western Massachusetts, so it's very white, and the university is certainly predominantly white. I'm at a place where there are wonderful people working on supporting faculty of color, and I have lots of opportunities. So there's like writing groups that meet twice a day. And there are a variety of different kinds of events that are planned online. And I do feel like that really helps me. I think that those groups really help me feel more centered and like I'm not all by myself. I also, one of the things that's been really interesting about this terrible pandemic has been I see much more of my family now. So I have dinner with family members who live like in the Bay Area or Iowa or Georgia. And that means I'm seeing more people that look like me and have experiences like mine. So, you know, that's been an unexpected kind of thing that's come out of this. But I think, you know, given the politics of this moment, it is just hard.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Scott, would you like to share any thoughts?
Sure, just two things. One, I agree with Joya, it is really, really hard. For me, maintaining relationships, particularly with the CompuGirls who are now in their late 20s. And so going on to our private Facebook page and checking in with them and seeing what they're doing. And then, I won't say secondarily, but another point is reading beautiful novels that are inspiring, that are well written, that inspires me, humbles me, but that is a lifesaver and also excites me to write and hopefully write well.
Thank you. And Dr. Goings, what are your thoughts on the subject?
I think for me, what keeps me motivated is that, it's particularly, I say after this webinar is over, I have a 2-year-old that's waiting and just like, Daddy, where are you? And so, you know, when I'm not focused on research, it's kind of all about her and getting her, you know, what she needs. So that keeps me in mind, because like, as researchers, we can get consumed with this. So I always think about like, I hope I'm doing good for her, because she's going to be, you know, the next legacy I leave. So definitely her. And then also from a professional level, just having supportive colleagues that I could, typically I wouldn't see as often, but now we're trying to figure out ways to connect on video like this. And then also my doc students that are at UMBC, I have them working on projects, and they really are keeping me motivated to keep pushing, because a lot of them want to become faculty members. So it pushes me to push them. So those are the things that really have kept me kind of grounded right now.
Wow, thank you. Thank you all for sharing that. And I'm going to transition to Dr. Bedley. She has another question and she will close out for today. I just want to take a moment to just say how profoundly impactful the research and the work that you have done and continue to do is. I am so thankful to be able to work with you for your time as virtual visiting scholars. And with that, I will transition to Crystal.
Thanks, Stephanie. I echo those sentiments completely, and am thrilled to learn even more about your projects than I've already had the opportunity to do. So in this conversation, a few new equity concepts were actually brought to mind. And I was hoping maybe you all could share a little bit more either about the concepts that I'll mention here briefly, or another equity concept that has really, maybe that had shifted your thinking, one that stays in your mind, that to keeping equity centered in the work that you do, in your life, and in the ways in which all of us bring this to the table, right? So, you know, Ramon, you had this wonderful metaphor about the campsite, right? We're motivated to do this work because we want to leave it better than it was before. That was beautiful. I hadn't heard that one before and really appreciated that. And then Kim, you had mentioned this idea about so you were critiquing, right, underrepresented minorities, and replacing that language, right, with underanticipated. That, I gotta be honest, that's the first time I've heard that one. So I would love to hear a bit more. And any other equity concepts, once again, that are like foundational to your thinking or have helped you sort of work through and navigate this space. I will let anyone speak first. Stephanie had a good flow, but whomever wants to jump in.
Ramon, you want to go? I want to hear from you first.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know what more to add to that, but I just believe that if any legacy that we can leave behind is making a space a little bit better for the next people that come along, I think that's well worth it. And I think for a lot of people that do equity and inclusion work, for better or for worse, and I think this goes for people that are therapists and social workers too, oftentimes we take the pain we've experienced and then we turn it into meaning by trying to reduce that pain that other people might experience. And I think that's probably the core of where that metaphor I used comes from.
I really like that. In answer to your question, I quickly alluded to a blog that my colleague Kamal Bob wrote about underrepresented minorities. And if you take the acronym URM, it sounds like a disease and it's very disempowering. And he and I had talked about that, and there's some literature about that. And so for me, I agree that when we can disempower very swiftly and very deeply with language. And I'm really conscious of using asset building approaches to research and ensuring that, to your point, Dr. Bartholomew, that we are leaving the places not better than where we left them. I think of Jackie Jordan Irvine saying how often researchers are treating research sites, particularly of people of color, as plantation sites. And we need to not do that. But I think in our language, we do that, particularly as it relates to STEM and disparity, by saying, underrepresented. Now, again, I get it. It's a quantitative statistical term. Obviously, we are underrepresented. I'm not going to argue that point. But what I'm saying is I'd rather focus on how the system has positioned us in a marginalized, state as opposed, and that we are under-anticipated by the system, which shifts the type of work that I'm doing to really focus on the system as opposed to the victims of the system. Hopefully that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I think language that reflects the structural inequities, right, is important so that we are shifting our perspective from some sort of deficiency with the individuals to really what the issue is, which is a structural barrier that they're facing. So I get it. That was beautiful. Dr. Goings or Dr. Misra, would you like to add anything? A different concept? No.
I'll just say, not necessarily a different concept, but when I think about equity, for me, it's not just about research because I live this. It's about like lived experience. So it's just thinking about always in my mind is like, how do I improve this? Because I'm in many ways trying to better the society for myself as well as those who I care about. So that's always in the back of my mind when I'm doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of this just rings really true for me, but I think we're committed to making the world better. And I know that that STEM research is better with lots of different perspectives in there. And I just think it's a shame that what I find, the thing that I feel like I have to fight against a lot of the time is that people do keep wanting to use that deficit model. And I just keep wanting to just sort of say, no, the model is how much better we all are together.
Absolutely. Thank you. So unless there are any other questions from our attendees today, we'll proceed to our conclusion. Of course, it goes without saying, but it will be said that we are incredibly grateful that you joined us all today. I'm thoroughly excited about this particular cohort and all the work that comes before you and all the work that will come later. I look forward to connecting again in the around this time, maybe a little earlier, in a year from now, and seeing where these projects have evolved to and what you've learned and sharing that across the art community. So we thank you so much for the critical work that you all are doing today and taking the time to have this conversation with us. And thank you everyone in the audience who joined us today. If you don't mind, we ask folks who attended to please complete our feedback survey. The link will be placed in the chat box and we'll also follow up in email. We really do look at these responses very carefully so that we can improve upon the kinds of resources that we're making available to folks. So thank you for taking just a few minutes to do that work. And we also want to talk with you about a few resources that we would like for you to review. What we've done here is highlight, and I'll talk a bit about each resource here, which is a publication from each of our scholars that aligns nicely with the work that they are currently engaging in their Virtual Visiting Scholars project. We start first with Dr. Scott and Steve Elliott's STEM Diversity and Inclusion Efforts for Women of Color, a critique of the new labor system, which draws parallels between today's computing labor system and sharecropping, and it was alluded to very briefly today. They advocate for DE&I funders, practitioners, and evaluators to not see women of color as commodities, but instead as autonomous agents interested in social and economic emancipation. Definitely feel free to check out this resource. It looks like it's centering equity in the ways that we've been talking about, and exciting to see. Next up, we have Dr. Ramón Goings, Making Up for Lost Time, the Transitional Experiences of Non-Traditional Black Male Undergraduates, which is an in-depth study of the lived experiences of these students, leading to their transition back to college and the institutional agents and programs to support them. Dr. Goings provides a range of practices universities can engage in to support Black men's degree attainment. Definitely worth the read. Next up is Dr. Barthelemy with colleagues Melinda McCormick and Charles Henderson's publication, Gender Discrimination in Physics and Astronomy, graduate student experiences of sexism and gender microaggressions. This article begins a conversation on sexism in these fields by providing language to discuss sexism in research groups and departments, and concludes with recommendations for addressing gendered microaggressions, one of the most common forms of sexism experienced. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Misra with colleagues Carrie Ann O'Mara, Audrey Yeager, and Courtney Lenartz's publication, Undoing Disparities in Faculty Workloads, a randomized trial experiment, describes several theory-driven interventions, which include an implicit bias workshop, tools to create faculty workload dashboards, putting into practice the data gathered through these dashboards, and optional professional development webinars that work in tandem to improve equity in the division of labor in academic departments. So each of these publications, as you see, is linked currently in the chat box. They are also available in the ARC Network's online resource library. And so all ARC Network members have access to this collection of nearly 2,000 resources related to equity in the academy that are housed in our resource library on Mendeley. Right, our resource library has been created and continues to be populated by the needs of our community members. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it or haven't looked at it recently, I strongly encourage you to either join the network if you haven't already, or sign up for Mendeley so you can have access to all of these wonderful publications. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time today. This concludes our webinar, and thank you for joining us.